Welcome to the Lost Science Fiction Stories, where extraordinary stories come to life. Enjoy the journey. The ceremonial hall was designed to inspire awe through sheer scale and accumulated symbolic weight. Vaulted ceilings that rose into shadows punctuated by bioluminescent patterns representing thousands of years of Velaran history. Walls carved with intricate historical narratives, depicting the rise of their civilization from planetary origins to interstellar power, and a central platform where Marcus Chen stood feeling profoundly out of place, despite 6 months of intensive diplomatic preparation for exactly this moment. He'd been briefed extensively on the selection ceremony by human diplomatic personnel who'd studied Velaran customs for decades, understood its enormous political significance for human-Velaran relations, recognized that his choice would shape interactions between their civilizations for generations to come. What the careful briefings hadn't adequately conveyed was the visceral experience of standing before 12 powerful alien women, while an entire civilization watched and waited with barely contained anticipation for him to select one as his formal bonded partner. The 12 candidates were arranged in a precise mathematical semicircle around the central platform, each positioned according to complex protocols involving their regional origins and political faction affiliations. They wore formal robes that incorporated elaborate symbols representing their family lineages and territorial claims, and they maintained the carefully composed expressions of people who'd been trained from birth to perform authority and dignity for constant public consumption. Marcus had met each of them during the extensive preliminary diplomatic functions that had preceded this ceremony, learned their names, their political positions within the complex Velaran governmental structure, their publicly stated priorities for the proposed alliance with humanity. They were all genuinely impressive in their distinct ways, demonstrably intelligent and accomplished, and apparently committed to strengthening relations between their respective civilizations through this formal bonding process. Queen Thessara stood on the elevated ceremonial dais overseeing the entire proceeding, her presence commanding absolute attention through sheer force of authority, even though she maintained perfect physical stillness. She wore the complete imperial regalia reserved for the most significant state functions, robes that incorporated threads of actual platinum, woven into traditional design patterns that predated human written language, the legendary crown of ascendancy that had been worn by 43 consecutive generations of Velaran rulers, spanning nearly 8,000 years, ceremonial jewelry incorporating gemstones mined from their civilization's original homeworld. Her characteristic pointed ears were adorned with formal ornaments that caught the hall's sophisticated lighting and created subtle prismatic rainbow effects across her silver-threaded skin. She embodied concentrated political power in ways that transcended mere formal position or official title. Marcus Chen of Earth, Thessara's voice carried across the massive hall with practiced vocal projection that required no technological amplification despite the enormous space. You stand before the Velaran sovereignty as official representative of humanity, formally invited to select a bonded partner from among the distinguished candidates who have been presented for your consideration. This alliance will bind our civilizations through personal connection that transcends mere political agreement or strategic calculation. The choice is yours to make freely according to your own judgment and preferences. Consider carefully and thoughtfully, for the selection cannot be revoked or modified once it has been formally declared before these assembled witnesses. Marcus looked at the 12 candidates again, acutely feeling the crushing weight of expectation from hundreds of observers filling every available space in the ceremonial hall. Each candidate represented safety for humanity, political alliance that would secure his species' precarious position in the bewilderingly complex web of galactic politics that humans were still struggling to comprehend. Each one offered tangible prestige, valuable access to Velaran resources and accumulated knowledge, concrete survival advantages for a species that had only achieved reliable faster-than-light travel within the last century, while most galactic civilizations had been exploring the stars for millennia. The logical choice was abundantly clear from any rational strategic perspective. Select one of the carefully vetted candidates, formally cement the crucial alliance, efficiently fulfill his assigned diplomatic function. He'd known for months that this specific moment was inevitable, had prepared himself mentally for making a decision that would materially affect billions of lives across two entirely different species, with radically different evolutionary histories and cultural frameworks. But standing here in the imposing ceremonial hall, watching 12 powerful, accomplished women who'd been offered up like elaborately decorated political chess pieces in some vastly complex game he barely understood, Marcus couldn't escape the growing conviction that something fundamental was profoundly wrong with the entire structural framework of this ceremony. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice steady despite the anxiety churning uncomfortably in his gut, "may I ask a clarifying question before making my formal selection?" A visible ripple of surprise moved through the assembled observers like a physical wave. The ceremony apparently didn't include established provisions for questions or dialogue. Thesara's carefully maintained expression remained diplomatically neutral, but something subtle in her eyes suggested genuine curiosity about where this unexpected deviation might lead. "You may ask your question. These 12 candidates who have been presented for my consideration, did they volunteer willingly for this position based on personal interest, or were they assigned to participate by political necessity and governmental obligation?" Another ripple of reaction moved through the crowd, this one carrying substantially more weight and evident discomfort. Thesara was silent for several seconds before responding with careful precision. They were selected by the Sovereignty Council based on comprehensive political considerations, family lineage qualifications, and extensively evaluated personal capabilities. Their participation serves the sovereignty's collective interests and demonstrates their commitment to our civilization's diplomatic objectives. So they didn't actually choose to be here of their own free will. They're fulfilling political obligations that were imposed on them by governmental authority. They are serving their civilization with appropriate honor and dedication, as is reasonably expected of those who occupy positions of significant power and responsibility within our hierarchical structure. Thesara's tone suggested she was beginning to understand that this conversation was heading somewhere genuinely unexpected and potentially problematic. Is there specific concern about their willingness to participate in this alliance ceremony? There's fundamental concern about characterizing this as a free choice when the entire structural framework systematically eliminates actual freedom of selection. Marcus looked at the 12 candidates again, seeing the carefully maintained neutrality in their composed expressions that probably concealed complex emotions they'd been trained never to display publicly. "I'm being offered 12 predetermined options, all of whom were politically assigned to this role through governmental mandate. That's not really genuine choice in any meaningful sense. That's just selecting from a predetermined menu, where someone else with greater authority decided in advance exactly what options would be made available." The candidates represent the full breadth and diversity of Velaran political factions and regional interests. The selection pool is comprehensive and appropriately balanced across multiple relevant criteria. The selection is comprehensive within parameters that were established entirely without my input or consultation. The framework was predetermined by Velaran political calculations that served your civilization's interests rather than providing genuine freedom of choice. He took a deep breath, committing fully to what he was about to do despite his clear awareness of the diplomatic chaos it would create. "Your Majesty, you explicitly said the choice is mine to make freely according to my own judgment. If that statement is genuinely true rather than just ceremonial language, then I choose you." The silence that fell over the massive ceremonial hall was profound and absolutely complete. Marcus could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears in the sudden total absence of ambient sound. No whispered conversations, no subtle rustling of elaborate formal robes, no small movements of hundreds of bodies. Just complete overwhelming stillness as hundreds of beings simultaneously processed what he just said and struggled to comprehend its implications. Thessara stood frozen on the elevated dais, her practiced diplomatic composure visibly disrupted by genuine shock for perhaps the first time in decades of wielding supreme authority. "That's not. The ceremony doesn't include provisions for." She stopped abruptly, visibly struggling to process the completely unprecedented situation. "I am the queen of the Velaran sovereignty. I'm not a candidate available for selection in this alliance ceremony. I know exactly who you are, Your Majesty. That's precisely why I'm choosing you." Marcus kept his voice deliberately calm and direct despite his racing pulse. "Every single candidate who was presented for my consideration was assigned to participate here by political calculation and governmental mandate. They're fulfilling imposed obligations rather than making voluntary choices based on personal preference. The only person in this entire hall who wasn't offered as an available option is you, which means you're the only one whose selection would actually represent genuine free choice, rather than just picking from a predetermined menu of politically acceptable options." But
I'm fucking homeless. Give me $1 or two. Help me out. Like I'm looking for a job.
Sorry
Blah,
for
blah, blah, blah,
interrupting
blah.
y'all's night. I know everyone's tired. Everyone's tired. Wake up, everybody. I got one thing to say, and then he'd go to the next car, and then he'd come back. And then I was like, oh my
It's
goodness.
awkward when he comes back, yeah.
Yeah, he
Yeah.
came back
Fucked
again.
up part about it is that motherfucker makes money doing that shit all day. You know he does. Even if he gets like $1 per car, like he's making money.
It smells so bad.
I'll give 15 subs if I throw.
you can't choose me. The ceremony specifically establishes that. The ceremony says I can choose freely. Those were your exact words, Your Majesty. The choice is yours to make freely according to your own judgment and preferences. If that statement is actually true, rather than just performative ceremonial language, then I choose the person who genuinely represents actual freedom, rather than political constraint and predetermined selection parameters. If it's not true, then the entire ceremony is fundamentally dishonest about what it's actually offering. Thessara looked genuinely speechless, a state Marcus strongly suspected she rarely, if ever, experienced in her long career, wielding supreme political authority. Her council members seated in the privileged front rows were exchanging urgent whispered conversations with barely concealed alarm. The 12 candidates maintained their trained composure, but several showed subtle signs of surprise or possibly relief at this unexpected disruption. The broader audience remained locked in stunned silence, processing the implications. "Your Majesty," Marcus continued into the heavy silence, "I understand this violates established protocol and creates substantial diplomatic complications. But I cannot in good conscience participate in a ceremony that explicitly calls itself a free choice, while actually being a political transaction dressed in elaborate ceremonial clothing. If I'm going to select someone for a bonded partnership that will fundamentally shape both our individual lives and our civilization's ongoing relationship, it needs to be genuinely authentic, rather than merely performed according to predetermined scripts." But you're not just rejecting individual candidates. You're rejecting the entire fundamental structure of the ceremony itself. I'm questioning whether the structure actually serves its explicitly stated purpose. If the goal is creating meaningful, authentic bonds between our civilizations, those bonds need to be based on genuine choice, rather than political calculation and governmental mandate. Otherwise, we're just building another diplomatic agreement with elaborate ceremonial decoration, obscuring its fundamentally transactional nature. Thessara descended from the elevated dais with slow, deliberate movements, maintaining careful control despite the obvious disruption to her normally unshakable composure. She approached Marcus directly, stopping close enough for relatively private conversation while still remaining clearly visible to the entire assembled audience. Do you understand what you've just done? The enormous political implications of publicly rejecting all the carefully selected candidates in favor of an impossible choice that violates every established protocol. I understand I've probably created a significant diplomatic crisis and complicated relations that were already challenging. But I'd rather deal with that honestly than participate in an elaborate ceremony that pretends to offer freedom while actually constraining choice to politically acceptable options that serve existing power structures. And your choice of me specifically, that's meant to make some kind of philosophical point about constraint versus genuine freedom. It's meant to make a point about authentic choice versus performed selection within predetermined parameters. Every candidate here was assigned by political necessity and governmental calculation. You're the only person in this hall who wasn't offered as an available option, because offering the Queen would fundamentally disrupt the power structure that the ceremony is explicitly designed to reinforce and legitimize. Choosing you is the only way to demonstrate that I'm actually making a genuinely free choice, rather than just selecting from predetermined options that someone else decided were politically acceptable. Thesara studied his face with intense analytical focus, clearly searching for any signs of deception, strategic maneuvering, or hidden agenda. You're completely serious about this. This isn't performance or calculated rebellion or strategic positioning. You genuinely believe what you're saying. Completely serious, Your Majesty. I was fully prepared to participate in this ceremony as planned, until I actually stood here and realized that calling it a free choice while systematically eliminating actual freedom makes the entire elaborate structure fundamentally dishonest at its core. If we're genuinely building an alliance between our civilizations, it should be based on honesty and authentic connection, rather than elaborate political theater that obscures transactional reality. You've just publicly rejected 12 distinguished candidates who were selected through months of careful evaluation, and declared your selection of the Queen, which violates literally every protocol governing this ceremony. The Council will never accept this disruption. Then perhaps the Council needs to seriously reconsider whether their established protocols actually serve the stated goals of creating meaningful, authentic bonds between civilizations, or whether they just perpetuate existing power structures through elaborate ceremony. Marcus kept his voice level despite the growing awareness that he just spectacularly disrupted one of the most politically significant diplomatic ceremonies in thousands of years of Velaran history. Your Majesty, I'm not trying to create deliberate chaos or insult your civilization. I'm trying to be honest about what genuine choice actually means and requires. One of the council members, an elderly Velaran whose elaborate formal robes indicated extremely high rank within the governmental hierarchy, stood from the privileged front row with visible effort. This is completely unprecedented and absolutely unacceptable. The human must select from the presented candidates according to established protocols or forfeit the alliance entirely. Those are the clearly defined parameters that govern this ceremony. Councillor Vexen, Thesara said without taking her eyes from Marcus. The human was explicitly told the choice is his to make freely according to his own judgment. He's making that choice according to his species' understanding of what freedom actually means in practice. We cannot simultaneously claim to offer genuinely free choice and then arbitrarily constrain it to politically acceptable options that serve our existing power structures. Your Majesty, with all appropriate respect, accepting this blatant disruption sets extremely dangerous precedent. The precedent it sets is that we actually mean what we say in our formal ceremonies, rather than just performing elaborate political theater with carefully scripted outcomes. He's correct that the structure is fundamentally dishonest about what it claims to offer. Thesara finally looked away from Marcus to address the council directly with clear authority. We offer 12 carefully selected candidates and call it free choice, but we've systematically eliminated actual freedom by constraining available options to politically calculated selections that serve our governmental interests. His choice of me specifically exposes that fundamental dishonesty in ways that cannot be easily dismissed or ignored. Another council member stood with barely contained frustration. Your Majesty, surely you're not seriously suggesting we accept this flagrant violation of established ceremony. I'm suggesting we acknowledge that the human has identified a fundamental structural flaw in how we approach political alliances and diplomatic bonding. We claim to value authentic bonds between civilizations while actually creating elaborate systems of constraint and predetermined outcomes disguised as free choice. She turned back to Marcus. Though I should note that choosing me specifically is impossible for multiple practical reasons beyond just protocol violations. I'm already bonded to another person. Marcus felt his stomach drop sickeningly. I wasn't aware of that, Your Majesty. The diplomatic briefings didn't mention existing bonds or personal commitments. Because my existing bond is personal rather than political in nature, and the sovereignty government considers it irrelevant to diplomatic functions and state ceremonies. But it definitely exists, which means your choice, while philosophically interesting, is practically impossible to fulfill even if we overlooked all the protocol violations. Something in her expression might have been genuine amusement despite the circumstances. Though I sincerely appreciate the implicit compliment in the selection, I apologize for the presumptuous assumption, Your Majesty. I should have been informed about. You should have been explicitly informed during your preparation that selecting the Queen was impossible for multiple reasons. Not just protocol, but existing personal commitments. The fact that you weren't informed is itself additional evidence of the fundamental dishonesty you're identifying in our ceremonial structures. She raised her voice to address the full assembly with clear authority. The human's choice, while impossible to fulfill in literal terms, raises critically important questions about how we structure political alliances and whether our elaborate ceremonies actually serve their explicitly stated purposes or just perpetuate existing power dynamics.
Okay. Okay, now I know where I'm at. Yeah, because this is where... Yeah, this is like the chill zone. So
Your Majesty, Counselor Vexen said with barely controlled frustration and evident alarm, we cannot possibly allow this unprecedented disruption to completely derail centuries of carefully established tradition. Counselor, the human has just clearly demonstrated that our centuries of established tradition include fundamental dishonesty about the nature of choice and freedom in diplomatic contexts. That's genuinely worth examining carefully rather than dismissing defensively. Thesara moved to stand beside Marcus in a gesture that clearly indicated she was aligning with his position rather than automatically supporting the council's traditional authority. I'm formally suspending the ceremony temporarily. We'll reconvene after the council, and I have discussed how to proceed appropriately in light of the human's valid observations about structural problems. The ceremonial hall erupted into chaotic conversation as formal protocol completely collapsed under the weight of unprecedented disruption. The 12 candidates broke their careful formation, several moving to speak urgently with various council members. The broader audience split into dozens of urgent discussions analyzing implications. Marcus stood in the center of the chaos he deliberately created, increasingly aware that he'd just taken what was supposed to be a carefully scripted diplomatic ceremony and transformed it into a genuine philosophical crisis about the fundamental nature of freedom and authentic choice. Thesara guided him away from the central platform toward a private antechamber, her security detail following at discreet distance, with expressions suggesting they were uncertain how to classify this situation. Once they were safely away from the main assembly, she gestured for him to sit in a comfortable chair. That was either the bravest or most foolish thing I've personally witnessed in a formal diplomatic ceremony during my entire reign. Probably both simultaneously, Your Majesty. I didn't plan to disrupt everything so completely. I just couldn't participate in something that felt fundamentally dishonest about what it was actually offering versus what it claimed to provide. But you do understand that by choosing me, even though it's literally impossible to fulfill for multiple reasons, you've completely undermined the ceremony's entire political structure and called into question centuries of diplomatic tradition. But I understand that I've created very significant complications for ongoing relations, but I couldn't see another way to effectively demonstrate that the choice wasn't actually free within the constraints that had been artificially imposed. Thesara sat across from him, her formal composure gradually giving way to something more genuine and less performed. In Velaran culture, rulers are never chosen by those beneath them in the hierarchy. We command obedience and expect deference. The idea of being actively selected rather than automatically obeyed is almost incomprehensible within our traditional hierarchical framework. What you just did, pointing at me instead of the politically acceptable candidates, it fundamentally dismantles assumptions we've held for literally thousands of years about the nature of power and choice. But I wasn't consciously trying to dismantle your entire culture, Your Majesty. I was trying to be honest about what genuine choice actually requires in practice. Honesty often dismantles comfortable structures that were built on unexamined assumptions rather than examined principles. She was quiet for a moment, clearly processing implications. Can I ask what specifically prompted this dramatic action, beyond the general philosophical concerns about freedom and authentic choice? Marcus considered how to articulate something he'd been processing only semi-consciously. During all the preliminary diplomatic functions, I met every one of the 12 candidates multiple times. They're genuinely impressive, demonstrably accomplished, apparently committed to the alliance. But every single conversation felt like they were fulfilling governmental obligations rather than expressing genuine personal interest. They were performing appropriate behavior because that's what their political positions required. The entire process felt fundamentally transactional rather than authentically interpersonal. And you wanted authenticity rather than political transaction. But if I'm entering a bonded partnership that will fundamentally shape my entire life and significantly influence relations between our civilizations for generations, yes, I want it to be based on something genuinely authentic, rather than political calculation dressed in elaborate ceremonial robes. He met her eyes directly. When I pointed at you, it wasn't because I have romantic feelings for someone I barely know personally. It was because you were the only person in that entire hall who wasn't performing governmental obligation. You were wielding actual authority, making genuine choices. That felt more authentically real than anything the ceremony was offering through its predetermined structure. So your choice of me was symbolic rather than personal in nature. But it was recognition that genuine choice requires actual freedom from artificial constraint. And you represented the only available option that wasn't politically predetermined by governmental calculation. You were the only person who wasn't part of the scripted performance. He paused. Though I should acknowledge that learning you're already bonded makes the symbolic point somewhat more complicated than I intended. But actually, it makes the point significantly more clear in important ways. You chose someone completely unavailable, which definitively demonstrates you weren't making a strategic selection from the presented menu of options. You were genuinely choosing freely according to your own understanding, even though that choice was literally impossible to fulfill. Thesara's expression carried something that might have been genuine respect. That's remarkably honest, even if it's politically catastrophic for traditional diplomatic protocols. They sat in thoughtful silence for several minutes, while the continuing chaos from the ceremonial hall echoed through the walls. Thesara seemed to be processing complex implications, while Marcus tried to calculate how badly he just damaged human-Velaran relations through philosophical stubbornness about authentic freedom. "Your Majesty," he said finally, "I should probably formally apologize to the Council and all the candidates. Disrupting the ceremony so dramatically wasn't meant as deliberate insult to anyone personally involved. But apologizing would completely undermine the valid point you made. The disruption itself is what forces necessary examination of whether our elaborate structures actually serve their explicitly stated purposes." She stood, moving to look out a window that overlooked beautiful gardens that had been carefully cultivated around the ceremonial complex. "You've created a genuine crisis, but not the kind you're probably imagining. The crisis isn't primarily diplomatic. It's fundamentally philosophical. You forced us to directly confront systematic dishonesty in traditional systems we've maintained without serious examination for thousands of years. That seems like a very significant problem for ongoing diplomatic relations. It's a significant opportunity for meaningful improvement if we're capable of recognizing it. The question is whether we possess sufficient wisdom to learn from valid criticism." She turned back to face him directly. "Marcus Chen, can I ask you something with complete directness?" "Of course, Your Majesty." If the ceremony had genuinely offered free choice from the beginning, if the candidates had volunteered based on personal interest rather than being assigned by governmental mandate, if you'd had the explicit option to refuse participation entirely without diplomatic consequences, if the structure hadn't been predetermined by political calculation, would you have approached participation differently? He considered the question seriously. If the choice had been genuinely free, I would have engaged very differently with the candidates, tried to understand them as complex individuals rather than political representatives fulfilling governmental obligations. Maybe discovered authentic personal connection with one of them based on actual compatibility rather than strategic alignment serving state interests. The predetermined structure prevented that possibility by making everything transactional from the very beginning. So the fundamental problem wasn't the basic concept of the ceremony, but the specific execution that systematically eliminated genuine freedom. The problem was calling it free choice, while actually constraining all available options to politically acceptable outcomes serving existing power structures. If you're going to offer genuine choice, offer actual choice with real freedom. If you're deliberately arranging a political marriage, be honest about that rather than dressing it in elaborate ceremony that falsely claims to offer freedom.
So the last train back to Jersey runs at 1.
That's remarkably blunt assessment of our traditional diplomatic practices. You asked for complete directness, Your Majesty. I'm providing it as honestly as I can. Thesara laughed despite the serious circumstances and ongoing crisis. I did explicitly ask for directness. Most humans are considerably more diplomatic when speaking to royalty. Most humans probably haven't just disrupted your most politically significant alliance ceremony by choosing the one person they literally couldn't actually select. I've already created massive chaos. Might as well be completely honest about the underlying reasoning. Fair point. She returned to her seat. I'm going to propose something to the council that will probably create substantial additional controversy. But I think it's genuinely necessary, given what you've clearly identified. What are you proposing? Complete restructuring of the entire ceremony. Instead of presenting predetermined candidates and requiring selection from that constrained menu, we'll make participation genuinely voluntary based on authentic personal interest. Candidates will actively choose to participate based on actual interest in partnership with the human representative, not governmental obligation. And you'll have the explicit option to refuse participation entirely without diplomatic consequences, if you don't find authentic connection with anyone who volunteers. Marcus felt surprise and relief in equal measure. Your Majesty, that's an extremely significant change to well-established tradition. You've just demonstrated that our well-established tradition is fundamentally dishonest about offering genuine choice. Changing it to actually provide authentic freedom seems like the appropriate response. She made notes on a portable device. Though I should warn you that this restructuring means the ceremony won't happen immediately as originally planned. We'll need substantial time to allow genuine voluntary participation to emerge naturally, rather than forcing it through political assignment. I'm completely fine with waiting if it means the eventual ceremony is actually honest about what it's offering versus what it claims to provide. Excellent, though you should prepare yourself for considerable council resistance. Many will see this as humanity imposing its cultural values on ancient Velaran traditions. Is that how you see it, Your Majesty? I see it as humanity identifying fundamental dishonesty in our traditions and forcing us to confront whether we actually value the principles we constantly claim to uphold. That's uncomfortable but genuinely valuable. She stood again. We should return to the ceremonial hall. I need to formally address the assembly about how we're proceeding. They returned to find the hall still in a state of barely controlled chaos, though conversations quieted noticeably as Thessara resumed her authoritative position on the elevated dais. Marcus stood beside the platform, profoundly uncertain about proper positioning, given that he just completely disrupted the ceremony's traditional structure. The selection ceremony is formally suspended, Thessara announced with clear authority that cut through all remaining conversations. The human representative has identified fundamental dishonesty in how we structure this alliance ritual, specifically, that we claim to offer genuinely free choice while actually constraining available options to politically predetermined selections serving governmental interests. After careful reflection, I agree with this assessment. A powerful wave of reaction moved through the assembly. Councillor Vexen stood immediately with evident alarm. Your Majesty, this is completely unprecedented. We cannot allow our formal ceremonies to be fundamentally dishonest about what they actually offer versus what they claim to provide. Thessara interrupted with unusual sharpness. The human was explicitly told his choice would be free. He made a choice that directly exposed the systematic constraints we've built into the ceremonial structure. Rather than defensively dismissing his observation, we should carefully examine whether our traditions actually serve their explicitly stated purposes. Another council member stood with barely contained frustration. Your Majesty, restructuring the ceremony based on one human's philosophical objections, based on valid identification of systematic dishonesty in traditional structures. If we genuinely claim to value authentic bonds between civilizations, our elaborate ceremonies need to actually provide authenticity rather than just performing it theatrically. She gestured at the 12 candidates. These distinguished individuals were assigned to participate based on governmental political calculation, not personal choice or authentic interest. That makes the ceremony fundamentally transactional rather than authentically interpersonal, regardless of how we dress it in ancient tradition. One of the candidates, a woman whose preliminary introduction had identified her as representing the coastal territories, spoke up unexpectedly with clear voice. Your Majesty, if I may. At Thessara's permissive nod, she continued. The human's observation is completely accurate. I was assigned to participate based on regional political considerations, not personal interest in forming bonds with humanity. I would have declined if genuine choice had actually been available. She looked directly at Marcus. No offense intended to you personally, but I'm already in a committed relationship that political obligation required me to temporarily set aside for this ceremony. Having that acknowledged openly feels genuinely liberating. Several other candidates made similar statements, publicly admitting they'd been fulfilling political obligations rather than expressing genuine interest. The widespread admission created visible ripples of recognition through the assembly. Apparently, many had privately suspected the ceremony's structure was problematic, but lacked framework for articulating concerns. Thesara let the organic conversations develop for several minutes before speaking again with clear authority. The ceremony will be comprehensively restructured to allow genuine voluntary participation. Candidates will actively choose to participate based on authentic personal interest rather than governmental political assignment. This will take substantial time to implement properly, but it will result in honest ceremony rather than elaborate political theater disguised as free choice. Your Majesty, Councillor Vexen said, his frustration barely contained. This sets extremely dangerous precedent for human influence over our ancient traditions. This sets precedent for actually meaning what we explicitly say in formal ceremonies. The human identified systematic dishonesty. We're responding by choosing honesty over comfortable tradition. That's not problematic foreign influence. That's recognizing valid criticism and responding appropriately. Thesara's tone carried absolute finality. The decision is made. We'll reconvene when restructuring is complete. Over the following months, the story of Marcus pointing at the Queen spread through both civilizations, becoming legendary proof that humans questioned systems rather than merely accepting them. Thesara restructured the ceremony completely, and when it finally occurred with genuine voluntary participation, Marcus found authentic connection with a scientist who shared his interest in examining whether structures served stated purposes. But the moment that persisted across civilizations wasn't the successful ceremony. It was when a human had pointed at the untouchable Queen and said, "I choose you," dismantling millennia of tradition through one gesture of authentic freedom. Sometimes genuine progress required disrupting comfortable systems. Marcus had done exactly that, teaching an entire civilization about the difference between performed choice and authentic freedom. The Queen had recognized that truth, and in valuing it, she demonstrated wisdom that transcended mere authority.